Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Monday, June 3rd, 2020. As you know, I thought I was going to be on my way to St. Petersburg. It's 8 o'clock in the morning here in the U.S. My trip was canceled due to events in Russia that are not national or major diplomatic events, but events that involve this trip. So I'm happy that the cancellation occurred before I left, and I'm happier still that you and I are together this morning. Thank you for coming on with such short notice at the last minute like this. Diplomacy. You are a former diplomat. You're an expert in the field. You have written about it extensively, including a very provocative piece over the weekend. Is diplomacy the art of deception?
It's become that. I don't think it should be, and I don't think it was. Diplomacy was something that is not much practiced today. People often say, and sometimes say to me, oh, well, what's your solution to something? And I suppose I'm not really a diplomat in that way, because I think that, there are times you cannot stand on the beach and you cannot command the tide to go out when you'd like it. You seem to have to wait for the tide to change, and then you can use those currents, hopefully, to move things. But basically, diplomacy also depends on channels, having channels open. I used to say to people, they come and say to me often, well, we'd like to go and meet such and such a group or something like that in the Middle East. And I say, listen, you can't just come here and sort of say, let's get to the bottom line. What's your position? What's our position? Let's do a deal and take the first plane home. You have to spend a lot of time investing in your meeting, especially in the East, where it's different from the West and people think in a different way. So you can't just sort of get on a plane, go over and sort of think you're going to resolve everything in a day on the back of an envelope and hop off back to Washington or Brussels or wherever you come from. So this is a different sort of diplomacy. So I feel also that sometimes, you have to have the ability to look at a conflict and realize, there is no solution at the moment. Perhaps after there's been a trial of strength, people will be in a position, will be able then to rethink their own position. And maybe then you'll be able to move slowly towards some form of political settlement. But today it's all become very much sort of downgraded and attenuated to sort of simply, quick call solution. What's the solution to this problem? Well, sometimes there isn't a quick solution. Sometimes trying a quick solution makes things worse. And that's what we're seeing both in Israel and it's what we're seeing in Russia too.
When Tony Blinken goes back and forth, I mean, does he realize between Washington and the various places he goes to, does he realize the dangers of deception or actual lying?
No, they think it's very clever now. It's very clever. I mean, the whole shift in Western way of doing business is to craft what they call a winning narrative, a narrative that suggests that the West is winning and that the other side, which generally is sort of evil and autocratic or a tyrant, the other side is simply, has a clunky narrative and it is not capable of winning. So I think, this idea of using winning narratives is really very dangerous in substance. It's a substitute for really trying to hear and understand what is going on with the other people.
Well, look, I mean, deception must be dangerous. I mean, if Joe Biden says that the Israelis crafted a proposal and in reality he crafted it for political reasons, who will believe anything that he says thereafter?
Well, exactly, because trust is not really always something that you have in these negotiations, but what you must strive for is a sense of integrity, that people believe that if you say something you mean it, and you believe it to be not wholly true, but at least not a lie. And this new form of diplomacy is about deceiving people, of trying to create a sort of narrative, trying to create something, and pitting your narrative against someone else's narrative. So if you do this, and if you do this in Israel and pretend that, that what you're announcing on national television has been approved by the cabinet and by the prime minister and government, when what you've probably done is picked up on an old proposal that was probably approved by a war cabinet, but maybe much against the will of the government as a whole, and then present that as if it's a new proposal and something that is significant and put pressure to take it up. I think in these cases, what people are trying to do is just go for the quick solution, the immediate solution. Let's get a ceasefire, let's get hostages released. The rest of it can take care of itself in the longer term. In any case, the pillars on what the rest of the proposal rests are not really in place. And I think that's very clear. It depends, first of all, in the Israeli terms, on a hostage release, which Hamas has to agree to. Then it would lead to some form of cessation of hostilities. In Hamas's view, it has to be a complete cessation, not a ceasefire, and the complete removal of troops from Gaza, none of which were expressed, if you like, in this recent proposal that was launched on Friday night. None of those details are there. Those are the sort of empty holes in it. And ultimately, then, it is all dressed up in the idea that there's a possibility of having Saudi Arabia normalize with Israel, and that will change the whole equation, and then it will be possible to resolve Gaza. We can get rid of Hamas, the narrative is, and then when we've done that, some state will come in, some peacekeeping Arab state will come in and pacify the area. But this is wishful thinking more than real diplomacy. Real diplomacy means you have to try and address actually the underlying problems. You have to face them, look them in the eye, and understand what they mean, and to try and get to a sort of element where both sides accept that the other side has a position and that it's an authentic one. And is it possible to find a form of commonality or not? And if it's not, then you don't want to make policies that are just going to make things worse. That's not really what you should be doing.
But to make a statement to the public, almost in the form of an address to the United States. I realize he wasn't in the Oval Office, but it did have the trappings of a very serious announcement from the President of the United States, coming on the heels of the conviction in the New York State Court of his predecessor and likely opponent in the November election. To make an announcement like that, claiming it came from the Israeli side, and then to provoke both tepid acceptance and harsh denunciations, I'm not sure where that gets A, the peace process, B, the hostages, both sides, the Palestinian hostages in Israel and the Israeli hostages in Gaza, or C, even advance the president's re-election campaign. I'm just not sure where this gets him. I mean, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have already said if Bibi goes along with this, they'll leave the government and he won't have a majority. And in the midst of all this, they're going to have another election. So, and maybe this is the understatement of the day, does Biden know what he's doing?
No, I don't think so, because I think we're living, all their sort of proposals of, and how they're going to get there and a two-state solution, which, clearly the government and the majority of Israelis say they're not ready for and won't accept. Well, that undercuts the whole Saudi initiative, Saudi normalization. The Saudis have made it very clear. Yes, they'll take, sort of whatever's going from the United States in terms of a defense agreement, but they're not going to go to normalization unless there is not only a clear but an irrevocable path to Palestinian statehood. And as I've said, we can talk about that, but it's not feasible unless people are really prepared to use force. Do they have the will, the political ability to use force? There are nearly 800,000 settlers on the land of Palestine as defined by the United Nations Security Council, on the lines of 67, living in the West Bank. Who's going to remove them? I mean, we talk about it glibly, but we don't have the means and we don't have the will, I suspect, of doing anything about this. So all of this is show, really. And I think all of this is really pressure on Israel to try and get sort of some form of calm in the run-up to the presidential elections in November. I mean, the US is starting this get into the main part of the election process. And I think it's all an aim to try and do that and say, well, hope that if the violence can be reduced in Gaza, then something might be achieved in Lebanon, and then something, might happen. Some Arab states might be willing to do more in Gaza. But all of this is, these are building on quicksand, because there's no sign that any of those pillars of this entire, if you like, this framework that starts with hostage release, starts with some form of end of conflict, and goes through the process to the Saudis then agreeing to a normalization. None of that is in place, and so it's not going to benefit. I think this was a really not a good decision by the White House to push Biden into doing this, because ultimately we don't know what is going to happen in the region, but at any time events may change it.
Does President Putin believe that Western diplomats have deceived him by their talk about peace, but their internal and outwardly manifested urge for war?
Indeed. He said so in a press conference in Uzbekistan. He said they deceived us. They led us by their nose. He's talking about that period after Maidan, when the Minsk agreements were being discussed and had seemingly achieved some degree of acceptance and agreement. And he said, they deceived us to think that they were trying to resolve this issue by peaceful means, when in reality what they were doing was all along planning to do it by armed force, the force of weapons and the force of arms. And the consequence of that was that, he was very explicit that we've stopped trusting the West anymore. We just don't trust them. We don't listen. We don't trust what they say. We don't believe what they say, and that's not a very good starting point for negotiations, particularly when the issues have now become so crucial, so sensitive, so dangerously close and edging towards wider war, that we don't have that ability to speak and have some degree of understandings and mutual understandings between ourselves and Russia. All we do is denigrate Russia, all we do is demonize Putin, and it's not the basis by which you can act if you wish to avoid escalation. Otherwise, escalation becomes almost inevitable.
Putin has also said that he believes that the European leaders believe that they're at war with Russia. Does he believe the United States is at war with Russia?
He says yes. He didn't actually say just he did, as you rightly said, he did pick particularly on the Europeans, who he says seem to, be hungry for war. And he says, we can't understand it because it's not in a European interest for this. But he singles out Britain and France, the leaders of those countries, as literally sort of hungering after some wider conflict and pushing strongly for a wider conflict. But he talks about it as NATO as a whole. So it does include the United States, and that he believes that the United States is involved. And he sees this process that is going on now, demanding the suggestion, the demand that that Europe and NATO use missiles that it is given to the Ukrainians to attack across the border into Russian territory, as a sign that the West and NATO has made the decision. And he says this very clearly, and Lavrov says it, the decision has been made. That clearly the West has opted to escalate and have a hotter war in Ukraine. This is just the first stage. But what after that? Okay, the first stage is that there's going to be rockets, artillery, and shorter range missiles fired across the border, where they say, our military bases are. And in fact, that very night, there was an attack on Belgorod, just over a city in Russia proper. I think it was 10 or HIMARS were fired at it, and they were all down by the Russian air defenses. But Belgorod is not a military city. It's not the sort of hub of the military. It's just a civilian city in Russia. Now, for the moment, just to be clear, what the Russian position is, they've said, okay, we are engaged in a conflict just over the border with Kharkov, the big city, which was originally a Russian city, and there will be a cross-border fire. In fact, this has been going on. Again, this is another piece of show. This great statement from NATO and from the President of the United States, we're going to allow non-long-range missiles to be used by the Ukrainians to defend themselves against attacks that are coming from just over the Russian border. They've been doing this for a year. They've been using, Storm Shadows and all of those missiles and HIMARS and firing them into Russia on the border area. Now, I think what was so important that Putin has said, which must be understood, is he said, okay, we can probably assimilate that. We can live with that. But if you use long-range missiles, cruise missiles, to attack deep inside Russia and against strategic targets of ours, then there will be a strong response against it. And that response will not be confined to Ukraine, but can take place in any other part of the world from which we determine that attack originated, i.e. the missile attack. And he made it clear that this is not just actually where someone pushed the button and set the missile off, but the whole panoply of support for missile attacks into Russia, i.e. the engineers, the NATO technicians that set up the missile, the NATO infrastructure of satellites, of AWAC planes that provides the data and does the targeting and sends the coordinates, and that the whole process is done by NATO. And that he says, you can't say you're not party to this war. You are deeply, deeply involved with it. And the warning is, you do this, and there may be a response. So, let me translate this. He's saying we are prepared to risk, if you like, an Article 5 concept. If you do this, we might, for example, I'm not saying this is what, he hasn't threatened this. I'm not saying it'll happen, but it's talked about. There's the big Western logistics base just over the border from Ukraine in Poland. Huge logistics. That's where all the logistics and a lot of the training goes. Something, for example, something like that might be hit with conventional forces. And then he poses the question, so what then does the United States do? Does it escalate further? And what element? And that's where we get to the point where people start worrying about tactical nuclear weapons. Because then, Russia or someone, certainly one Russian official who is not part of the government but has a high standing, has suggested that's the point. Then the West will be warned that if they want to take the next step up the ladder, then it will risk the use of tactical nuclear weapons against them. This is a very serious moment in our relationship with Russia, and people don't seem to notice it.